What?
I had what alcoholics refer to as a moment of clarity.
That was a legit moment of clarity, mate. That very moment there, that was you watching me, witnessing a benchmark score for the i5-12600K. Not the i9, mate, the i5. As I'm stood there just sort of gawping gormlessly at the screen and the number, kind of like I'm staring at the clouds of Bird Box. Well, that's the moment when I realised just, well, for a start, how rinsed out the 40nm process has been for the last 7 years, but just how back in the game Intel are with Alder Lake. So make grab or hide your wallets, depending on your circumstances, because this is very possibly your time to upgrade. But before I get into all that, I do have to clarify this. This video is split into chapters though, so you can't skip ahead if you're not interested in all the waffle. But I do need to clarify this because it's super relevant. I've bought more AMD CPUs over the years than anything else I care to count, but and I bought the 5600X as well, specifically for this video that you're going to see in here. But what I don't have is a 5900X or a 5950X. And AMD, and you have to trust me, it's not for the lack of tireless and repeat attempts at trying over a number of years now. But their CPU team just aren't interested in talking to or working with this channel, which is entirely their prerogative. They're allowed to do that, that's fine. But I do have to draw the line somewhere with buying every CPU in existence, or I'd be bankrupt by now. So for that reason, I'm not able to test the 5900X against the 12900K. And AMD are of course absolutely free to choose who they want or don't want to work with, but if they do want to have future representation in reviews like this, which aren't gaming focused, well, they know where I am, but I think I've spent about enough on the CPUs already. But for the 5900X, obviously I can't and I shouldn't, and I don't want to ignore its existence, so what I'm going to have to do is extract results from third parties where applicable. But you'll have to bear in mind that those scores will not be accurate comparisons to mine. In fact, it's arguably completely pointless to include them alongside my results, given how different the systems will have been that those tests would have been done on. But I've tried to pick scores that at least look reflective of normalized typical results from those CPUs. Anyway, we're not here for that. We're here for 12th gen, mate. So if you're thinking to yourself as you're watching this, hang on a minute, Neil, hasn't it been a hot minute since 11th gen was released? Well, yes, it has, mate. In fact, 11th gen has been the shortest lived Intel Core desktop generation since as far back as I could be asked to count. In fact, it was only 7 months ago you were watching the 11th gen version of these videos. Stopgap much? Well, the beat goes on, and we're marching to the beat of the 12th gen Intel i5-12600K and the i9-12900K, both released to the public today as part of the new Alder Lake architecture, along with the i7-12700K, which Intel bizarrely don't sample to the press. But enough hyperbole and waffle. I'm sure you don't need another lecture about P&E cores.
What is he, Chinese, Japanese, Pekingese? Get on your f***ing knees.
Thanks, Mr. Grant. Bear in mind, if you're new here, this is Tech 3D. I don't do games, and Intel didn't give me these CPUs, didn't sample them to me to be just another generic sort of tech CPU tester pumping out the exact same sort of charts that you'll see from, quite frankly, dozens of other far more qualified and resourced outlets who'll do a far better job than I ever could. But I will start with taking a look at some temperatures and frequency charts because they're just interesting. But the video, like I say, is split into chapters, so you can jump ahead if you're only interested in taking a look at the benchmark results.
Literally could have finished by now. Get on with it.
I am, man. We'll begin with a high-level look at some sensory data taken from both the i9 and the i5 over a full Autodesk Inventor InvMark benchmark test run. And much has been speculated on and gossiped about how this generation is going to run like a blast furnace made by the i9 under a decent closed liquid cooler. Factory stock settings on an Asus ProArt board peaked at 84 degrees, and that was under full all-core load during the InvMark ray tracing test. And as you can see, I've color shaded the regions for the different stages of the test, so you can see what was happening at different parts of the test. And InvMark is a true representation of a professional's daily system load with a mixture of sort of opening, light and heavy data sets. There's drawing view computations, FBA, finite element analysis, assembly build, and the like, sort of single and multi-threaded workloads, mixture of everything. And for the most part, the CPU on the i9 remained at around 60 degrees and under. The power draw has been another widely gossiped about topic, but again, at stock frequencies, the i9 remains well in spec, with the package power sensor reporting no more than 225 watts power draw under all core load. I personally don't have the tools, the resource, or the inclination to measure that any more accurately than that, but that's the sensor data reported back to me. And for the majority of real-world heavily single-threaded P-core workloads, you're kind of looking at sub 100 watt power draw on the i9. Speaking of the P-cores though, sensor logging for core load just got both more interesting and awkward because HWinfo64 now splits each core into two, keeping separate sensor logs for both threads per core. That's great having more data, but it's a nightmare trying to chart 16 plot lines. No easy way to do this, but here's an attempt at showing all P-core utilization over a full InvMark run. In the end, it's messy, but what stands out for me is just how many of the P-cores appear to be utilized during what are known and objectively exclusively single-threaded workloads, suggesting that either the thread director is continuously bouncing the process between cores, or the sensor logging isn't quite 100% accurate at the moment. I don't know. A prime example of this would be the assembly pattern and constraint tests. Absolutely 100% single-threaded workloads, those, but P-core 5, 6, and 7 are all showing high elevated utilization during those tests, with the remaining P-cores showing activity around the low to mid 20% mark. There was nothing else going on at the time. It was a fresh build of Windows 11, so there's definitely something I want to investigate there later when I've got more time and no deadlines to meet. And at the same time, I think same thing applies to the E-core utilization. Very odd sensor logs here. It's still a complete unknown how we should expect the application to interface with the P and E cores. But during the FEA test, for example, which again is a single-threaded workflow, my parametric study computes 10 variations of analysis during that test, and you can clearly see the 10 spikes in E-core utilization for that part of the test. But why are all the 8 E-cores firing during a single-threaded workload? It's genuinely baffling me. And if you're questioning whether it's me that's mistaken here, and the fact that I designed the entire test isn't quite enough to quash your doubts on that, well, someone in the past has thrown a 64-core Threadripper 3990X at the FEA test, and it scored significantly less than my 4-core Dell XPS 13 thinner light convertible, so as it did as well at the assembly patterning and build, so that's why I'm kind of scratching my head a little at these sensor plots. P-core real-time frequency. What even is default spec now for frequency? Because we're at a point now where there's so many factors that influence how a processor behaves. There's different motherboards with different defaults. What then becomes the default? I thought I'd done enough to get this to a reasonably standard state in the BIOS, only to then go through a week of testing to then realize just yesterday that Windows 11 had somehow at some point changed and defaulted to the high performance power plan, which has somewhat of an impact on how the processor behaves. So as you can see from said chart, for reasons that I haven't quite figured out yet, Windows 11 has decided that 4.9 GHz was the new P-core base clock for the i9. But either way, that doesn't really impact boost frequencies that much, which remained within spec. Occasionally, TurboMax boosts to 5.2, with 5.1 GHz being achieved quite frequently. Interestingly, the Windows power plan didn't have too much influence over E-core frequency, with 2.4 GHz base clock being respected throughout the InvMark test run, with what should be those single-threaded workloads seeing the frequencies pushed to the advertised spec frequency of 3.9 with dips to 3.7 during the all-core loads. With package-level overclock applied using Intel XTU is where you can begin to see temperatures and power draw understandably increase quite considerably. Per-core overclock is the better option for tighter control over application performance, and this is where I kind of expose my inexperience in overclocking, as I frankly just don't understand it all yet, and all the nuances to that absolutely massive world of variables. I will at some point, but for now I just simply set P1 to 5.4 and then P-cores 2 to 8 to 5.3 with the E-cores leveled to a 4.1 GHz overclock, which is 200 MHz over spec. The instruction here was that when one P-core is under load, the frequency should be set to 5.4 and then 5.3 when multiple P-cores are utilized. Thermal limits and whatnot ultimately overrode my very weak overclock, but when you see the actual benchmark results, the overclock still delivered a reasonable gain over stock frequencies. Another interesting chart is the power draw with overclock applied. And the reason I say it's interesting is because Intel state the MTP, or the max turbo power draw on the i9, is 241 watts, which I would have thought would have been at stock frequencies, but I'm seeing absolutely exactly 241 watts pulled when the i9 was pushed beyond its factory spec, for example, with all P-cores locked at 5.3 GHz. Obviously, you can loosen these tolerances with overclocking, but personally, I'm not quite there yet. I didn't play around with that during this. Honestly, I don't think the majority of my audience will be doing any of that. So I think there's some value in mileage in just showing what results you'll get from a basic, simple, and relatively safe frequency nudge only on an overclock. Reed, I'll try and blast through the rest of these as I'm sure you're eager to see the results, but the i5-12600K testing was done under identical conditions to the i9 mostly. Stock temperatures on the i5 peaked during an InvMark run at a very respectable 65 degrees, averaging mid 40s to low 50s. Again, the high performance power plan had been enabled at some point, still don't know how, which saw the base clock set to 4.5 gigahertz with a boost of 4.7, and then regular turbo max boost to 4.9. The E-cores perfectly on spec, falling within 2.8 to 3.6. The 12600K power draw again falls under the claimed processor base power rating given by Intel of 125 watts, with a max power draw of around 122 watts observed during the 2D drawing background view computation test, which is an all-core load that is multi-threaded in Autodesk Inventor. The overclock applied to the i5 was done in an identical way to the i9. It was a package level overclock with the multi-core enhancement, or MCE, enabled in the BIOS just out of pure curiosity. I just wanted to add an extra variable in there. So the package level frequency nudge in XTU was applied at 5.1 GHz to core P1, and then P cores 2 to 6 set to 4.9 GHz, with the E cores bumped 200 MHz to 3.9. No real surprises in the frequency range, with the P cores fluctuating a little bit, but mostly remaining at the 4.9 range, dipping to 4.8 due to thermals. Similar story for the 4 E cores on the i5. The overclock saw them frequently respect the 3.9 GHz boost, whilst still revisiting their base clock of 2.8. Power draw was an interesting one on the overclocked i5 though, because this exceeded the 150 watts max turbo rating given by Intel. Very much likely as a result of the MCE being enabled in the BIOS, with the i5 drawing 170 watts of power during the all-core CPU ray tracing test and just over 160 watts during the drawing view computation. However, even with that power draw, temps under the heavy-duty Thermaltake Tough Liquid Ultra 360 CLC, wow, that's a mouthful, temps remained at a reasonable 85 degrees max during ray tracing, with averages of around the mid-40s to mid-50s during regular load, which is pretty respectable for an overclocked read. Results, let's get right into this now, mate. Obviously, Autodesk Inventor is where we're going to start. We're going to jump straight in with my speciality, their flagship MCAD software that I personally specialize in, and that I spent an unspeakable amount of time designing a benchmark tool for, which was then coded by Kadak Group. Links in the description to give Kadak some love. And it was made for this exact situation. So I've got an entire online leaderboard of results to validate against here. But just so you can appreciate the magnitude of what you're about to see, here's how things stand right now. InvMark has a competitive leaderboard with the top 50 entries being overclocked uploads in most cases. It is competitive, everyone's overclocking to get up to the top of the board. But general rule of thumb right now is anything from 45 to 55K is pretty epic. That's a pretty epic score, with 53 to 56K being the absolute top tier, elite, best that money can buy today for Inventor. And generally that also applies to Fusion 360 as well, because anything that's good for Inventor is good for Fusion 360 and pretty much all Autodesk apps. So the i9-12900K at absolute stock frequencies with MCE disabled landed on the board at 66,675. That's an almost bang on 25% single generational improvement across an entire 3D CAD testing suite. That includes part modeling, drawing computation, FEA, ray tracing, assembly build, and tons others. It's a near 45% overall passive productivity improvement from just the 10900K from 2 generations ago. And if you're still on Skylake 6th gen, well, that's getting around 33K in InvMark. You can do the ROI on that one. That's just stock frequencies. And it's no secret, because I built a channel around demonstrating this stuff, that these programs are intensely frequency sensitive. So about that overclock that I did very loosely. Well, simply going into the Intel Extreme tuning utility, clicking 8 arrows, then apply. Don't even need to reboot. Honestly, never thought I'd ever see this. Very basic package level overclock puts the i9-12900K at 71,105 points. It's breached 70K. Do you remember this?
What?
Well, like I said, that wasn't me stood shock at the i9 score, mate. Bear in mind, the i9's a $590 part. What about that i5, which is a $290 part? Because at stock frequencies with MCE disabled, the i5 lands on the board at 62,743. Repeat, 62,743. The $290 i5 is 17% faster than the i9-11900K across the board at Autodesk Inventor. And to boot, at stock frequencies is faster than the fastest ever recorded overclock unit submission to the leaderboard from the 11900K. And it's also 30% faster than the 5600X. And that's all at stock. And if you drop an overclock onto it, the i5, well, it'll hit 64,669, which isn't that far off the stock 12900K. And for Autodesk Revit 2022, Autodesk's flagship BIM software for architects, the RFO benchmark test is the primary tester in that field, and whilst it lacks any kind of online leaderboard, studying feedback from users suggests that the modeling test is the primary area of focus, with anything under 100 seconds being an impressive result. The 10900K was landing in and around the 100-second mark, with the 11900K being, well, with its waste of sand classification. Well, that saw an impressive 20% gain in that area, taking it to around 81 seconds for the modeling test, with the Zen 3 competitors landing around mid-80s to low 90s. The stock at 12900K hits the 60-second mark for the modeling test, which is a blisteringly fast and consistent 25% increase over the 11900K, as per what we saw exactly with the InvMark results. The Overclocked 12900K then saw the i9 easily breach sub 60 seconds, landing at 57.38 on the RFO modeling test, smashing every world record and cementing itself as the best CPU on the market by a considerable margin for Autodesk Revit. The i5 posted equally impressive results, 66.74 seconds stock and 63.1 with the package overclock, putting the stock configuration of the i5 28% ahead of the 5600X. 5900X result seen on the chart was taken from the Puget Systems testing done on Revit 2021, which, although isn't all that much different to Revit 2022, that and the different system config means it can't really be compared objectively to my 12900K runs, but going off my own experience, I wouldn't very much doubt that 89.5 result would change too much if it was done under my control conditions. And now that element of surprise is gone, and you know how good these are, I'll just show the full charts in full from the get-go. Starting with the Revit RFO graphics test, which follows a similar trend to what we saw during the modeling tests. All 12th gen parts breached the 20-second mark for graphics, which is largely a CPU-bound operation, with the overclock having not quite as much of an impact as it did in the modeling, with only a 3% gain versus a 5% gain back there. I've recently added PCMark 10 to my bench suite because it focuses on real-world productivity tests, and this, as well as pretty much all the rest of the tests, not many surprises from here on in 12th gen, topping the charts in a consistent expected linear scale. Unfortunately, again, no leaderboard to pull reference data from for Ryzen parts, but from my testing, I'm seeing between 16 to 28% gain from the 5600X to the 12600K across PCMark testing suite. Vray 5 CPU ray tracing is next, which is an all-core CPU intensive workload, and with GPU ray tracing being the preferred platform these days, I'm not actually sure how much general interest there's going to be in CPU ray tracing capability, but it's worth validating anyway, with Vray being a widely used engine. Not too many surprises here. The Ryzen 5950X results taken from the Vray leaderboard, and that still dominates these workloads with brute force thread count. However, the 12900K isn't in competition with that, and it would be with the 5900X, which it marginally beats out, albeit only just. However, at the entry level, the 12600K represents an incredible 44% all-core performance gain at stock over the 5600X at Vray, although I just wouldn't recommend buying an i5 for Vray CPU ray tracing. You just wouldn't do that. Luxion's Keyshot is an extremely popular multidisciplinary visualization package offering both CPU and RTX-based ray tracing output. Unfortunately, again, with no public leaderboard to go alongside their freely available benchmarking tools, so results here are limited to my testing stack. No great shocks, with the i9-12900K scoring 4.72 with a 4.89 overclock. A surprise for me though was seeing the 12600K beating out the Comic Lake 10-core i9-10900K, which tipped the i5 in Vray but not in Keyshot, and yet another 45% gain for the i5 over the 5600X. Good old Cinebench R23 next. Pretty easy to grab other samples to showcase here, as there's plenty of data to choose from. But regarding my own data, it's a consistent positioning, but the margins are even more expanded here, with the 12600K taking a 65% lead over the 5600X at what would be Cinema 4D multi-core workloads, and the 12900K roughly at 23% lead ahead of the 5900X. A single core performance on Cinebench falls in line with all previous tests, yet again emphasizing the quite remarkable single-threaded performance uplifts that we're seeing over 11th gen, which had been the single core king for most pro workflows, but for 7 months. But with the 12900K hitting 1948, representing a 22% increase over the 11900K at 1599. But yet again, the i5 absolutely destroys the identically priced 5600X with a near 40% benefit to single-threaded performance in this particular scenario. This is the 3D Mark CPU profile test at max threads. I'm not going to lie, I'm not entirely sure what this workload is supposed to represent. The literature states 3D rendering, audio and video production, and software development, which is a bit overly diverse and somewhat of an ambitious task to represent all with one number. But there you go, that's where things stood on that one. But bouncing back to something a bit more up my street is the oddly named UL Procyon, which is either named after a family of raccoons or a particular star in the sky named after a dog. I just don't know. I don't know where these people get these names from. And much to my surprise, that tests Adobe Premiere Pro and Photoshop, because why wouldn't they name that after one of two furry four-legged animals? I don't know. It's actually an excellent test though, 1080 and 4K encoding with H.264 and H.265 video export. And by now, to absolutely nobody's surprise, the 12th gen parts absolutely destroy this, with the 12600K and the 12900K being 22%, 29% respectively ahead of the 11900K, which was frankly utterly dismal at this. And the Procyon photo editing test is another well-designed workflow which begins by importing digital negative images into Lightroom Classic before processing multiple edits and layering effects in Photoshop. The poor showing for the 10900K suggests that this is more of a single-threaded workflow, which again allows the P-cores to grab a hold of this and wring its neck. Now a test that I was a bit hesitant to add into this suite was the Cadalyst C2015 AutoCAD benchmarking test. I've always wanted to test AutoCAD, but it's just lacking any kind of meaningful benchmark suite. But this test's old, and it looks like it hasn't been worked on since, well, 2015. But after evaluating what this test actually does, I decided that it looks like it's doing just about enough to be somewhat useful in this scenario. Now the Cadalyst test spits out several scores at the end, most of which aren't necessarily a reflection of the CPU as an individual part. So rather than present irrelevant information, we'll just stick with the dedicated CPU index score, which clearly indicates that 12th gen is indeed going to be the best CPU that money can buy for Autodesk's breadwinner. And when you consider the 11900K would have been previously the holder of that title, the fact that the 12600K drops a 32% lead over that at a $290 price point, don't forget, that's how good that i5 is. And finally, to wrap this up, there's 3 more tests to go through, all very similar, following a similar pattern basically, mate. All CPU-based ray tracing workloads using Arnold in Maya, 3D Studio Max 2022, and an automotive visualization example using Autodesk Vred 2022. Absolutely no further surprises here. 12900K on top, with the rest jostling for position down below. There you have it, mate. 12th gen is absolutely killing it. In my opinion, the absolute clear star of the show by an absolute mile is the i5-12600K. That part is utterly outstanding. Now, of course, we're in the business of buying or building systems that make us money, not for entertainment. We're not buying these for gaming, so spending $590 or $290 on a CPU, right? $300 difference to some of us, that's kind of half a day rate. So when your PC is your breadwinner and you know it's going to pay you back over the years, sure, go for the i9. In a business system, I kind of don't see any particular need to have to cut costs when that cost will be easily absorbed into the utilization of the system over time. But if you're a student or an educator or a hobbyist or someone who just doesn't really fit into the definition of what I've just described, well, the i5 is absolutely the one to go for, because with the i5, we're talking a mere 6% difference to the i9 in the CPU index in AutoCAD, and 9% difference in the Revit modeling test at stock, and again, only a 6% difference across the entire InvMark testing suite on Autodesk Inventor, which means the i5 will be absolutely outstanding in Fusion 360, because both Inventor and Fusion 360 are very much cut from the same cloth. Now, a couple of points to note. Call them words of caution, if you will, because if you're considering 12th gen in an OEM system, for example, like a Dell pre-built or a Lenovo pre-built, for example, specifically that i9 with its significant power draw, well, these OEMs, they're going to have to up their game with their cooling solutions to ensure it can breathe and do its thing without being catastrophically crippled by cheap, naively leveraged proprietary air coolers. That's something that I'm going to try my best to keep tabs on as I try to obtain samples of these OEM pre-builts on the channel. So get subscribed if you want to try and get a hold of some content on those. Now also, if after seeing this you're completely sold on 12th gen, well, first of all, links are going to be in the description where possible to all the parts that were used in the testing process if you want to basically replicate exactly what I used. But this is an entirely new platform, mate. You'll need a new motherboard on the Z690 chipset, and performance results, well, they're going to vastly differ over time as we see the platform mature, as we see, for example, higher speed DDR4 testing done with 12th gen, bearing in mind all of this testing was done with early DDR5 parts. but it should only get better, to be fair. But to conclude, if I was to give this entire launch a clickbaity title, basically 12th Gen for CAD professionals is going to look like an exact 100% passive performance increase for those who are still on 6th Gen and the Skylake generation. With your CAD applications, they're going to be literally twice as fast if you're upgrading from that. And anyone on a platform between then and now, well, given it's a 25% gain across the board over 11th Gen, it's pretty much a stone wall mate recommendation from me to upgrade if you have the means to do so.
Oh, actually, I'm waiting for AMD's 3D V-Cache, sticking with my Athlon XP.
If you want to spend your life stagnating and endlessly waiting for the next thing and the next thing, and you just sit there just thinking you're going to buy the next thing that comes, you do you, right? That's absolutely fine. I can't guarantee that I'll have the means to cover AMD's response to this, which should be soon, hopefully, but what I will say is that I don't subscribe to the ideology of constantly waiting for the next thing to come out based on hype and corporate promise. Surely history has taught us a few lessons on that by now. And I do acknowledge as well that the tested AMD Zen 3 platform is 1 year old now. It's been out for a while, but it is what it is. They will likely be releasing a new line at some point soon, but this is real, and this is by far the best platform for your CAD applications and professional workflows, bar the quite rare sustained parallel compute operations, which we don't really see much of these days. Well, there you go, lad. That was a job. Like I say, if you want to buy into 12th Gen, I'll put all my Amazon paid affiliate links in the description if you want to support the channel and buy these parts along with all the other component parts used during testing if they're available yet. But I do absolutely want to give a huge, massive shout out to both Asus and Thermaltake for basically allowing all of this to happen. This video is not sponsored, but they supported this and me by giving me the motherboard, the RAM, the cooler, the power supply, along with some other exciting parts, which I'm going to use in future videos, like a new workstation Slayer build, along with other types of testing content that I'm going to do on 12th Gen. I'm going to do a lot of it, but legit, without their help, I could not have done any of this. So thank you very much to Asus and Thermaltake for being absolute bros on this, man. They were amazing. Thank you as well for watching. If you're not subscribed by now, do it. It's just down there, mate. The button, ding the bell if you value content like this, which isn't gaming and helps people who just want to get some work done and know what the best system is for work. Stick around because there's a lot more of it coming up, but I need your support. So thanks again. I'll see you next time. Doodles.
What am I doing? What are you doing, Neil? You're like Kurt Cobain. What is this character meant to be?
Load up on guns, bring your friends.
Once there was this kid who
Then it all came unglued.
had turned from black into bright white.